November 27th, 1941, Fort Stotzenburg, Philippines. Second Lieutenant Edwin Price Ramsey adjusted his cavalry sabre one final time as the thundering hooves of his 26th Cavalry Regiment echoed across the parade ground. What he couldn't know in that moment was that he was about to participate in the last mounted cavalry charge in United States military history. More remarkably, what began as a traditional cavalry officer's career would transform into something unprecedented, a metamorphosis from West Point-trained horseman to master of guerrilla warfare, who would spend 3 years behind enemy lines orchestrating one of the most successful resistance campaigns in military history. The mathematics of survival were already being written in the chaos of the Japanese invasion. Within weeks, the structured world of military protocol would collapse into something far more dangerous and infinitely more complex. Ramsey would discover that everything he had learned about conventional warfare was merely the foundation for lessons he never expected to need. The path to that final cavalry charge had begun 24 years earlier in a small Illinois town where Edwin Price Ramsey entered the world on May 26, 1917. His childhood was unremarkable by most standards, shaped by the values of Middle America in the aftermath of the Great War. Like many young men of his generation, Ramsey was drawn to military service not by desperation or lack of options, but by a genuine sense of duty and adventure that characterized American youth in the interwar period. His appointment to West Point in 1935 placed him among an elite group of future officers who would face trials their instructors could never have imagined. The military academy in those years still emphasized traditional military virtues, honor, duty, country, concepts that seemed eternal and unshakable. Ramsey excelled in his studies, particularly in military history and tactics, absorbing lessons from Napoleon, Lee, and Patton, with the intensity of someone who believed he might someday apply them. The cavalry branch that Ramsey chose upon graduation represented both tradition and transition. By 1939, when he received his commission as a second lieutenant, military planners were already questioning the relevance of horse-mounted units in modern warfare. The German blitzkrieg had demonstrated the devastating effectiveness of mechanized forces, yet the United States Army maintained its cavalry regiments, partly from tradition and partly from the practical reality that horses could operate in terrain where vehicles could not. Ramsey's assignment to the Philippines in 1940 reflected the Army's recognition that the archipelago's mountainous jungles might still favor mounted troops over tanks. The 26th Cavalry Regiment, composed primarily of Filipino soldiers under American officers, represented one of the last genuine cavalry units in the world. These men and their horses would soon face an enemy that had already proven the obsolescence of such romantic notions of warfare. Fort Stotzenburg, located about 60 miles north of Manila, served as headquarters for the 26th Cavalry and epitomized the peculiar nature of American military presence in the Philippines. The base combined modern facilities with frontier conditions, air-conditioned officers' clubs alongside barracks that relied on natural ventilation. American officers lived in comfortable quarters with Filipino servants, maintaining a lifestyle that preserved the social hierarchies of colonial administration, while preparing for a war that would obliterate such distinctions. The regiment itself was a study in contrasts that would prove prophetic. The horses were magnificent animals, carefully selected and trained for military service. The Filipino troopers were skilled horsemen and dedicated soldiers who understood their homeland's terrain better than any American officer. The weapons were a mixture of modern and obsolete Springfield rifles alongside cavalry sabres that belonged to an earlier century. Ramsey threw himself into training with characteristic intensity. He studied the Filipino scouts who served as guides and interpreters, learning not just their language but their intimate knowledge of local geography and culture. These relationships, formed in peacetime garrison duty, would prove invaluable when conventional military structure collapsed and survival depended on understanding the human terrain as much as the physical landscape. The warning signs of approaching war were unmistakable by late 1941. Japanese forces had been fighting in China for 4 years, demonstrating tactical innovations and brutal efficiency that shocked Western observers. Intelligence reports documented the movement of Japanese naval and air forces throughout the Western Pacific. Yet the daily routine at Fort Stotzenberg continued with peacetime normalcy that seems almost surreal in retrospect. Training exercises focused on traditional cavalry missions, reconnaissance, screening, and rapid deployment to threatened areas. The regiment practiced charges against hypothetical enemy positions, maneuvers that had changed little since the Indian Wars of the previous century. What they did not practice was what they would actually face: coordinated air and ground attacks by a technologically superior enemy with overwhelming numerical advantage. December 7th, 1941, shattered the illusion of peacetime preparation. News of Pearl Harbor reached the Philippines within hours, transforming theoretical war plans into immediate reality. The Japanese attack on Hawaii demonstrated the enemy's capability and ruthlessness, but it also revealed something more ominous. The simultaneous nature of the assault suggested coordination and planning on a scale that American military leaders had underestimated. For Ramsey and his fellow officers, Pearl Harbor meant the end of preparation and the beginning of a test they were not ready for. The 26th Cavalry received orders to move immediately to defensive positions, but those orders reflected strategic thinking that was already obsolete. The regiment was expected to function as mobile reserves, responding to enemy landings and supporting infantry units in conventional defensive operations. The Japanese invasion of Luzon began with devastating air attacks that eliminated American air power within the first 48 hours. Clark Field and Nichols Field, the primary air bases defending the Philippines, were destroyed in coordinated bombing raids that caught most aircraft on the ground. This air supremacy allowed Japanese forces to land virtually unopposed at multiple points along the coast. Ramsey's first combat action came not in a dramatic cavalry charge, but in the mundane reality of retreat. Japanese forces advancing inland forced American and Filipino units to fall back toward defensive positions that existed more on maps than in reality. The 26th Cavalry found itself screening the withdrawal of larger units, a mission that required constant movement and frequent engagement with enemy patrols. The landscape itself became an enemy almost as dangerous as the Japanese. The Philippines' mountainous terrain channeled military movement into predictable routes that enemy forces could easily interdict. Dense jungle provided concealment but limited mobility for mounted units accustomed to open country operations. Rivers and ravines created natural barriers that could trap retreating forces or provide defensive advantages to those who understood how to use them. It was in this environment of tactical confusion and strategic collapse that Ramsey began his transformation from conventional cavalry officer to something entirely different. The skills that West Point had taught him, map reading, tactical planning, leadership under pressure, remained relevant, but their application required adaptation to circumstances that no military academy could have anticipated. The Filipino soldiers under his command proved invaluable in this adaptation process. They understood the terrain intimately, knowing which trails could accommodate horses and which would prove impassable. More importantly, they understood the local population, distinguishing between civilians who might provide assistance and those who might report American positions to Japanese forces. This human intelligence network would become the foundation of everything that followed. In conventional warfare, civilians are obstacles to be avoided or protected. In guerrilla warfare, they become the sea in which irregular forces swim. Ramsey's early recognition of this principle would determine not just his survival, but his eventual transformation into one of the most effective resistance leaders in the Pacific theater. The final cavalry charge that awaited him would mark not just the end of an era in military history, but the beginning of a personal journey that would test every assumption about duty, honor, and survival in ways that no West Point textbook could have prepared him for. The moment arrived with devastating swiftness on December 16th, 1941. Japanese forces advancing toward Bataan Peninsula had broken through defensive lines that existed more in theory than reality. The 26th Cavalry Regiment received orders that would have seemed routine weeks earlier but now carried the weight of desperation. They were to conduct a delaying action near the village of Morong, buying time for retreating American and Filipino forces to establish new defensive positions. Ramsey studied the terrain through field glasses as his squadron prepared for what would become their defining moment. The Japanese advance guard, approximately 2 companies of infantry supported by light armor, was moving along the main road with the confidence of an army that had encountered little effective resistance. Their column stretched for nearly half a mile, vehicles and troops in formation that suggested they expected no significant opposition. The tactical situation was textbook cavalry warfare, an enemy column vulnerable to flank attack in terrain that favored mounted troops. But this was 1941, not 1861, and the enemy possessed automatic weapons, artillery support, and air cover that could arrive within minutes. Every principle of modern warfare argued against what Ramsey was contemplating. Yet conventional tactics had already failed catastrophically. American forces had been outmaneuvered, outgunned, and overwhelmed by an enemy that seemed to anticipate every defensive measure. The structured approach to warfare that had dominated military thinking for decades was proving inadequate against Japanese innovation and aggression. Lieutenant Ramsey made a decision that would echo through military history. Rather than conduct a fighting withdrawal or establish defensive positions, he would attack. Not with the cautious probing actions that characterized modern reconnaissance, but with the full-blooded cavalry charge that belonged to another century. The preparation was surreal in its contrast to the surrounding chaos. Ramsey's troopers checked their weapons and adjusted their equipment with the methodical precision of peacetime training. Horses snorted and stamped, sensing the tension of their riders. The Filipino cavalrymen showed no fear, only the focused intensity of professional soldiers preparing for combat. The charge itself lasted less than 5 minutes, but compressed within that brief span was the collision of 2 eras of warfare. Ramsey led his squadron down the hillside toward the Japanese column. Sabres drawn and rifles ready, hooves thundering against the hard-packed earth. The sound was magnificent and terrifying, a rolling thunder that announced the arrival of something the enemy had never expected to encounter. The Japanese forces, caught completely off guard by an attack that violated every principle of modern tactics, initially froze in confusion. Soldiers who had been trained to expect tanks, artillery and aircraft suddenly faced mounted warriors wielding weapons from the previous century. The psychological impact was devastating, creating moments of paralysis that allowed the cavalry to close distance before effective resistance could be organized. Ramsey's sabre found its target in the first seconds of contact, cutting down a Japanese officer who was attempting to rally his men. Around him, Filipino troopers fired from horseback with deadly accuracy, their intimate knowledge of their mounts allowing them to maintain stability while engaging multiple targets. The charge carved through the enemy column like a blade through silk, scattering infantry and creating the chaos that had been the cavalry's traditional advantage. But modern warfare quickly reasserted its dominance. Japanese machine guns opened fire from concealed positions, their sustained bursts cutting down horses and riders with mechanical precision. Artillery support, called in by radio from surviving officers, began falling among the cavalry within minutes of the initial attack. The romantic image of mounted warriors gave way to the brutal reality of 20th century firepower. The retreat was as chaotic as the charge had been organized. Ramsey found himself separated from most of his squadron, leading a handful of survivors through terrain that seemed to shift from familiar to alien with each passing hour. The Japanese pursuit was relentless and methodical. Coordinated sweeps that drove the Americans deeper into mountainous country where conventional military operations became increasingly difficult. It was during this retreat that Ramsey's real education began. The lessons of West Point, valuable as they were, had prepared him for warfare between organized armies following established rules. What he now faced was something entirely different. A struggle for survival that would require abandoning everything he thought he knew about military service. The Filipino civilians who provided shelter and guidance during those first desperate weeks taught him lessons that no military academy could have offered. They showed him how to read the landscape not as a tactical problem, but as a living system where every village, every trail, every source of water represented both opportunity and danger. They taught him to distinguish between collaboration and a survival, understanding that in occupied territory, the line between friend and enemy was often invisible and always shifting. More importantly, they showed him that conventional military hierarchy was not just irrelevant but counterproductive in guerrilla warfare. Survival depended not on rank or formal authority, but on trust, competence, and the ability to adapt to circumstances that changed daily. The Filipino soldiers who had served under him in the cavalry became partners in a struggle where American military doctrine offered no guidance. The transformation was gradual but irreversible. The cavalry officer who had led a charge against Japanese forces began to disappear, replaced by something harder and more dangerous. Ramsey learned to move at night, to live off the land, to gather intelligence through networks of civilians who risked their lives for information. He discovered that successful guerrilla warfare required patience, cunning, and a willingness to accept casualties among people he had grown to respect and care for. The Japanese occupation forces, initially focused on conventional military threats, were slow to recognize the danger posed by scattered groups of American and Filipino fighters operating in remote areas. Their early counterinsurgency efforts relied on traditional military sweeps and punitive operations that often strengthened rather than weakened resistance networks. Each heavy-handed response to guerrilla activity created new recruits and deeper resentment among the civilian population. Ramsey began to understand that this was not just a different kind of warfare, but a different kind of war entirely. Victory would not come through decisive battles or territorial conquest, but through the gradual erosion of enemy control and morale. It was a war of patience and endurance where success was measured not in ground gained, but in infrastructure destroyed, supply lines disrupted, and enemy forces tied down in fruitless security operations. The radio became his most valuable weapon, more important than any rifle or explosive device. Communication with other resistance groups and eventually with Allied forces in Australia provided the coordination necessary to transform scattered bands of fighters into an effective guerrilla army. Intelligence flowed both ways, information about Japanese troop movements and defensive positions in exchange for supplies, weapons, and strategic guidance. By early 1942, the young cavalry officer was gone, replaced by a guerrilla leader whose name would become legend among the resistance fighters of Luzon. The transformation was complete, but the war was just beginning. The networks that would define Ramsey's guerrilla empire began forming in the most unlikely places. A chance encounter with Captain Claude Thorpe, another American officer who had escaped capture during the Bataan collapse, provided the first glimpse of what coordinated resistance could achieve. Thorpe had already established contact with Filipino civilian leaders in the central Luzon provinces, men who understood that Japanese occupation meant not just military defeat, but economic exploitation and cultural suppression. These civilian leaders brought something to the resistance that no military manual had ever described. They possessed detailed knowledge of Japanese administrative procedures, transportation schedules, and security protocols. More importantly, they commanded networks of trust that had been built over generations, relationships that could move information, supplies, and people across occupied territory without detection. Ramsey discovered that effective guerrilla warfare required thinking like a businessman rather than a soldier. Every operation had to generate more resources than it consumed. Every attack had to strengthen the resistance rather than simply inflict damage on the enemy. The romantic notion of guerrilla fighters living off the land gave way to the practical reality of managing supply chains, maintaining communication networks, and coordinating with civilian populations whose survival depended on resistance success. The Japanese response to increasing guerrilla activity revealed both their strengths and vulnerabilities as an occupying force. Their military efficiency, so devastating in conventional warfare, became a liability when applied to counterinsurgency operations. Rigid command structures that had conquered half of Asia proved inflexible when facing an enemy that refused to present conventional targets. Japanese security sweeps followed predictable patterns that guerrilla spotters could anticipate and report. Their reliance on roads and established transportation routes created choke points that could be exploited through carefully planned ambushes. Most significantly, their treatment of Filipino civilians suspected of supporting the resistance created new recruits faster than military operations could eliminate existing fighters. Ramsey learned to read Japanese tactical doctrine like a chess player studying an opponent's preferred openings. Enemy forces would establish base camps in defensible positions, then conduct sweeps radiating outward in systematic patterns. The sweeps were thorough but slow, allowing guerrilla forces to relocate before contact occurred. More importantly, the Japanese pattern of returning to base camps after each sweep created opportunities for intelligence gathering and preparation of future operations. The transformation of local Filipino units from scattered survivors into disciplined guerrilla forces required adapting American military training to circumstances that violated every assumption about conventional warfare. Traditional military hierarchy based on rank and formal authority gave way to leadership structures based on competence and trust. Filipino officers who understood local conditions often outranked American personnel in practical terms, regardless of formal military protocol. Weapons training became an exercise in improvisation and conservation. Ammunition was too precious to waste on extensive target practice, so marksmanship instruction relied on dry firing and detailed explanation of ballistics principles. Explosives training focused on maximizing damage with minimal resources, techniques that emphasize placement and timing over raw, destructive power. Edwin Price Ramsey's journey from cavalry officer to guerrilla commander represents one of the most remarkable transformations in military history. The young lieutenant who led the last cavalry charge in American military history emerged from the Philippine jungles 3 years later as a master of unconventional warfare whose methods would influence resistance movements worldwide. His story proves that true leadership isn't defined by the circumstances you're given, but by how you adapt when everything you thought you knew proves insufficient for survival.